150 yards. That's how far the wind dragged Private Jeff Duvivier across the stony Libyan desert before a thorn bush snagged his parachute canopy and stopped him. 150 yards of rock, gravel, and scrub at the speed of a sprinting horse, his rifle ripped from its webbing, his canister of explosives lost somewhere in the black void behind him. When he freed himself from the harness, blood running down his right leg, he looked back at the ground he'd just traveled, and by his own account written into his diary the next morning, thanked whatever God was listening that he was still alive. Duvivier was one of the lucky ones. He was one of 22 men who would walk out of the Cyrenaican desert 3 days later. 34 of his comrades would not. Some were already dead, some were wounded and dying among the rocks with no one to find them, and some had been rounded up by Italian sentries at the airfield they had been sent to destroy. None of them, not one single man, had placed a single bomb on a single aircraft. The date was the night of November 16, 1941. The operation had a code name, Squatter. And as the first gray light came up over the desert on the morning of November 17th, the unit that had launched it, a unit that had existed for less than 4 months, was staring at total annihilation before it had even fired a shot in anger. 2/3 of its strength gone in a single night. Every officer present either captured, killed, or stumbling through the desert with bleeding feet. And waiting back in Cairo, a military bureaucracy that had never wanted this unit to exist in the first place, ready to shut it down the moment the news reached headquarters. The unit was called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. Within 4 years, it would be fighting in Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. Within 60 years, it would be the most studied, most imitated small unit special operations force on Earth. But on the morning of November 17, 1941, it was a catastrophe. And the story of how it survived that catastrophe, how one man refused to let it die, how he found a partner in the desert who rescued everything, and how a disaster became the foundation stone of a legend, is the story of why the SAS exists at all. To understand what happened that night, you have to walk back 4 months, to a military hospital in Alexandria, Egypt, in the brutal high summer of 1941. A tall, lean Scots Guards lieutenant named David Sterling was lying in a bed, his lower body partially paralyzed, staring at the ceiling and thinking. He was 25 years old. He had been sent down from Cambridge for drinking and gambling. He had tried to become the first man to climb Mount Everest, training for it in the Alps and the American Rockies before the war had interrupted everything. He had volunteered for the Commandos, shipped out to the Middle East with a unit called Lay Force, and watched that unit disintegrate under German fire in Crete and at the Litani River, achieving almost nothing for the British cause in the process. Sterling had concluded, lying in that hospital bed, that the entire British approach to raiding was wrong. Lay Force had tried to insert commandos by sea in battalion strength, 200 or 300 men landing on a beach trying to achieve surprise. It was impossible. The ships were too visible, the coast too well defended. By the time the men were ashore, the Germans and Italians knew where they were. Sterling had an alternative, developed in conversation with a fellow officer from No. 8 Commando, a Welsh-born Oxford graduate named John Steele Lewis, whom everyone called Jock. Lewis had intercepted a consignment of 50 parachutes in Alexandria that were destined for a parachute brigade in India. With permission from the commando's colonel, Lewis had begun experimenting with airborne insertion. Sterling had joined him. During one of those experimental jumps from an obsolete Vickers Valentia biplane bomber, Sterling's parachute had snagged on the tail of the aircraft and his canopy had partially collapsed. He had hit the desert hard enough to damage his spine, and for several weeks he could not walk. The idea he and Lewis had been developing was this: instead of hundreds of men by sea, send 4 or 5 men by air. Instead of a battalion storming a beach, send a tiny group of highly trained specialists hundreds of miles behind enemy lines to attack the airfields where the German and Italian aircraft were parked on the ground. A Messerschmitt fighter was worth almost nothing sitting on a runway with a charge on its wing. A Junkers bomber was just a pile of aluminium and petrol until it was in the air. The enemy's air power, Sterling reasoned, could be broken not by shooting their aircraft down at 8,000 feet, but by walking up to them on the ground and putting a 1-pound bomb on each one. The problem was selling the idea. The British military bureaucracy in Cairo, known as Middle East Headquarters, was, in the blunt assessment of nearly every soldier who ever encountered it, hostile to irregular thinking. Sterling knew that if he submitted his memorandum through the proper channels, it would be buried in a junior officer's in tray and never seen again. So he did something that would become part of the regiment's founding legend. Still on crutches, still half paralyzed, Sterling made his way to the Middle East Headquarters compound in Cairo. He was refused entry because he had no pass. He abandoned his crutches, forced his way under or through a section of the perimeter fence, accounts vary on the precise method, and hobbled into the building with his lower body barely working. A sentry gave chase. Sterling ducked into the first open door he could find, which happened to belong to an officer he had once had an argument with. He ducked out again and into the next door, and that door led to the office of Major General Neil Ritchie, the Deputy Chief of Staff of Middle East Command. Ritchie, to his eternal credit, did not have the impudent young lieutenant arrested. He read the handwritten memorandum Sterling had been carrying, a proposal for a raiding unit of approximately 60 men operating in 4-man and 5-man teams, inserting by parachute, destroying enemy aircraft on the ground, and being extracted overland. Ritchie took it to the theater commander, General Sir Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck, himself a soldier who valued initiative, approved it. On July 1, 1941, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade was formally constituted. The name itself was Theater. There was no Special Air Service Brigade. The designation had been invented by a British deception officer named Dudley Clark to convince German intelligence that Britain had a parachute brigade operating in North Africa. Sterling's tiny unit was supposed to provide physical evidence that the fictional brigade was real. The unit would, in time, give the name real meaning. Sterling established his training camp at Kabrit, on the edge of the Great Bitter Lake, about 100 miles south of Cairo. The facilities were essentially nothing. The unit had 3 tents and very little else. Sterling's solution, recorded in multiple accounts, was to send his men on a night raid against a nearby New Zealand division camp, from which they stole tents, bedding, furniture, lamps, chairs, and in one account, a piano. This was the first operation ever conducted by the Special Air Service. The target was an Allied unit. The objective was furniture. With a camp established, the real work began. Sterling recruited Jock Lewis as his training officer, and it is in large part to Lewis that everything the SAS would later become can be traced. Lewis was an ascetic, a perfectionist, a man with what his comrades remembered as an almost monastic discipline. He was the brains of the unit in a way that Sterling, by his own admission, was not. Lewis designed the training program, and the program he designed was brutal. Recruits were put through long forced marches across the Egyptian desert, carrying heavy packs in temperatures that could reach 110 degrees Fahrenheit by day and drop near freezing by night. They were taught desert navigation from the stars, survival on minimal rations, first aid, demolitions, close quarter battle, and silent night movement. One of Lewis's more controversial innovations was to practice parachute landing falls by having men jump off the backs of speeding lorries onto the sand. Men were regularly injured. Some broke bones. It was, in the words of the early veteran Jimmy Story, the hardest training any of them had ever done. And then the actual parachute training began, and it nearly killed the unit before its first mission even launched. The SAS had no parachute instructors. Britain's central landing establishment was at Ringway, outside Manchester, and Sterling had been sending request after request for technical advice, for equipment specifications, for guidance. Ringway had not responded, so the unit improvised. They rigged static lines to the floor of an obsolete Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft, a type so old it was being phased out of frontline service, and they jumped. On October 17, 1941, a trooper named Ken Warburton exited the aircraft and his static line failed. The clip holding it to the aircraft's interior rail sheared. His parachute never deployed. He fell approximately 600 feet and was killed on impact. The next man in the stick, Private Joe Duffy, stood in the open door of the Bombay, watched his friend hit the desert, and was ordered to jump. He jumped. His static line also failed. He died on the same patch of ground. Sterling grounded the unit that evening. He examined the equipment. He discovered that the static line clips being used were inadequate for the weight of a fully loaded parachutist. He also discovered, when Ringway finally responded to his appeals and sent technical notes at the end of October, that Ringway itself had suffered a fatal accident weeks earlier caused by exactly the same equipment failure, and hadn't thought to warn the unit in Egypt that was using the same clips. The rage this caused in Sterling, by every account, was cold and absolute. The next morning, after the equipment had been reinforced, someone had to jump first to prove the fix worked and to restore the men's confidence. According to the testimony of Reg Seekings, who was present, and contrary to the version that appears in many later accounts, it was Jock Lewis who jumped first. Sterling jumped shortly after. Nobody died. Training resumed. By mid-November 1941, L Detachment had been training for approximately 14 weeks. They had lost 2 men to parachute failures. Several others, including Lieutenant Bill Fraser and Private Jock Byrne, were still recovering from training injuries and could not deploy. But the rest were ready. They had to be ready. Because General Auchinleck had just launched the offensive that would justify their existence. Operation Crusader was the largest British offensive of the North African campaign to date. Its objectives were to drive the German Afrika Korps and their Italian allies out of eastern Libya, relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk, and seize the Libyan airfields from which the Luftwaffe was strangling the British convoys attempting to resupply Malta. The offensive was scheduled to launch on November 18, 1941. On the night of November 16th, to soften the enemy air forces before the ground attack began, Sterling's men would parachute behind the lines and attack the German fighter squadrons where they sat on the ground. The plan was ambitious in the way that only plans drawn up by officers who have never actually run the operation they are planning can be ambitious. 55 men, divided into 5 sticks of 11, would be flown in 5 Bristol-Bombay transport aircraft of 216 Squadron RAF from a forward airfield at Bagouche, approximately 300 miles west of Cairo. They would drop at night onto desert drop zones roughly 30 miles inland from the Libyan coast. They would lie up during the day of November 17th. At 1 minute to midnight on the 17th, all 5 sticks would attack their assigned airfield simultaneously, working in silent pairs, placing 1-pound explosive charges, a device invented by Jock Lewis and soon to be known throughout the special operations world as the Lewis bomb, onto the wings of every German and Italian aircraft they could find. 15 minutes after the first charge was placed, all bombs would detonate more or less together. The men would withdraw through the dark to a prearranged rendezvous point approximately 40 miles inland, on a desert track called the Trig al-Abd, near a point called Rotondo Segnale. There they would be met by the long-range desert group and driven back to Egypt. The targets were 2 airfields at Gazala and 2 airfields at Tamimi, plus a subsidiary objective. Between them, the airfields were estimated to hold approximately 300 aircraft. The weather forecast delivered to Sterling at Bagouche on the afternoon of November 16th was catastrophic. A severe storm was moving across the Mediterranean. Winds at the drop zones were forecast at 30 knots, nearly 35 miles per hour. Rain was expected. Visibility would be poor to nil. By the standards of the Royal Air Force's own parachute training manuals, the conditions were far beyond what was considered acceptable for a training jump, let alone an operational insertion at night over unknown terrain. Sterling had a choice. He could cancel the operation and return to Cabrit, which would almost certainly mean the permanent cancellation of his unit. Middle East headquarters was already full of officers who had never believed in L detachment and who were waiting for any excuse to shut it down. A canceled first mission would be fatal. Or he could jump into the storm, accept catastrophic losses, and hope that enough men made it to the targets to inflict enough damage to justify the unit's existence. He asked the pilots how they felt. One pilot told Johnny Cooper, a 19-year-old trooper who would later be a lieutenant colonel, that the conditions were very, very dodgy, and asked if the colonel wanted to call it off. Sterling's answer, according to Bob Bennett, who was present, was 4 words: "No, certainly not." At approximately 5:30 in the evening on November 16, 1941, 5 Bristol Bombay transport aircraft, heavily overloaded with men, weapons, water, rations, and wooden equipment canisters, lumbered into the sky from Bagush and turned west into a night that was already getting blacker. The pilots had orders to navigate by dead reckoning to the coast, then turn inland and find the drop zones using the light of flares dropped by Royal Air Force Albacore aircraft bombing the target airfields as a diversion. Within an hour, the plan was in ruins. The storm was not just a storm. The war correspondent Alexander Clifford, who was based at Bagush that week, described it as the most spectacular thunderstorm within local memory. Lightning broke across the sky in almost continuous sheets. The rain came down in wind-driven walls that reduced visibility to near zero. Inside the Bombays, the men could hear the wind hammering the aluminum skin. They could feel the turbulence bucking the airframes. And then the German and Italian anti-aircraft gunners on the coast heard the aircraft engines and opened up. Johnny Cooper would later describe looking out of the Bombay's open door and seeing the whole sky beneath him, laced with red and green tracer, searchlights swinging through the rain. The interior of the fuselage lit up like the inside of a cinema projector. One of the 5 Bombays took enough hits that it had to turn back. The men aboard never reached the drop zone. Another was shot down outright somewhere over the Libyan coast. The pilot, Charles West, was badly wounded. His co-pilot was killed. The 10 SAS men aboard, led by Lieutenant Ian McGonigal, a close personal friend of Paddy Mayne, survived the crash landing in various states of injury and were captured within hours. One of the men, Private Douglas Keith, who had earlier marched 40 miles in his stockinged feet during training, succumbed to his wounds. The rest, including Jim Blakeney and Roy Davies, spent the next 3 years in prisoner-of-war camps. Blakeney and Davies did not return to Britain until October 1944, having finally escaped. The 3 remaining Bombays continued, and now the pilots faced an impossible problem. They could not find the coastline fix points they had been given because the storm had obliterated the stars they needed to navigate by, and the coast itself was invisible in the rain. When they turned inland, they had no idea where they were. The albacores that were supposed to bomb the target airfields and provide a visual reference were either unable to find them in the storm or unable to drop bombs in conditions that made bombing pointless. The pilots of the Bombays, in near total darkness, gave the green light to jump because the men they were carrying had to jump somewhere. Sterling's stick jumped first. The men began leaving the aircraft at intervals of about a second, the way they had trained. And the wind took them. 30 knots at ground level is a survivable wind for a trained parachutist. But this wind was gusting, turbulent, swinging through 90 degrees and back again with the passage of the storm cells. Parachutes that opened properly were jerked sideways and downwards in opposite directions within the same breath. Men hit the ground sideways, backwards, head first. Those who landed without breaking bones, and most of them did break something, were instantly at the mercy of the next problem. Their canopies, still inflated, were being dragged across the stony desert at running pace by the wind. A parachute harness in that era had a single quick-release box in the center of the chest. It worked perfectly when the man was standing upright and calm. It worked very poorly when the man was being dragged face down across rocks at 15 miles an hour, arms flailing, trying to find a metal disc, by touch, in pitch darkness. Duvivier was dragged 150 yards. Johnny Cooper, who somehow landed without breaking anything, was dragged until the wind was momentarily knocked out of him. Sergeant John Cheney of Lewis's stick jumped, landed, and was never seen again by any man of the SAS for the rest of the war. Whether his parachute dragged him over a cliff edge, whether he was killed on impact, whether he was captured and died in a camp without being identified, no one has ever been able to establish. Equipment was worse. The wooden canisters holding the Lewis bombs, the weapons, the water, the rations, and the detonators had been dropped on separate parachutes, a common practice at the time. Those canisters landed kilometers away from the men who were supposed to use them. In the storm-black desert, with no lights and no radio, a man looking for a canister had a search area the size of a small town, and nothing to guide him but dead reckoning from where he thought he had landed, which was not where he had actually landed, which was not where the canister had landed either. By first light on November 17th, each of the 3 sticks that had managed to jump was in the same state. Men wounded, some badly. Weapons and bombs missing. Water short. Every member scattered over ground measured in miles rather than yards. Jock Lewis, whose stick had been the best organized, managed to gather most of his men and conduct a search for their equipment. They found almost nothing. The official after-action report stated that the detachment was widely dispersed and demolition material soaked. Even the bombs they did recover had been submerged in rain and were unlikely to detonate reliably. Lewis made a hard-eyed professional judgment. With no bombs, no reliable weapons, and men limping from injuries, an attack on a defended airfield was suicide without any corresponding chance of success. He aborted the attack and began the march to the rendezvous. Paddy Mayne, a huge, devastatingly capable Northern Irish lawyer and former international rugby player, came to the same conclusion at his own drop zone. He had lost contact with Lieutenant Charles Bonington's half of his force. He had Walking wounded. The rain had ruined his explosives. He turned his men towards the Trig Al Abd. Sterling, whose stick had been dropped probably the furthest from where it was supposed to be, was in perhaps the worst condition of all. Nearly every man in the stick had been injured on landing. Only Sergeant Bob Tate had landed unscathed. Sterling decided that he and Tate would push on alone to try to attack the airfield at Gazala, while the rest of the stick, under Sergeant Major George Yates, would head for the rendezvous. Sterling and Tate made it a few miles before the storm, and the dark and the terrain finally defeated them too. They abandoned the attack and turned south. Yates's section, trying to reach the rendezvous, was captured. Waiting for the survivors at the Trig Al Abd, approximately 40 miles inland, was a unit commanded by Captain David Lloyd Owen and his colleagues from a small extraordinary force called the Long Range Desert Group. The LRDG had been in existence for 18 months. It was made up of men recruited from New Zealand, from the Brigade of Guards, from the Yeomanry regiments, and from southern Rhodesia. They drove modified Chevrolet and Ford trucks across thousands of miles of interior Libyan desert, navigating by sun compass and starshot, mapping the terrain, watching enemy traffic, raiding where opportunity offered. They were the finest desert navigators in any army in the world. They had been told to collect the SAS from the rendezvous point and had been given a 3-day window to do so. On November 18th, nothing came in. Mayne, leading the largest intact group, was still crossing the desert on foot, 34 miles of broken stone ground, carrying his wounded. The storm had eased, but the cold at night was savage, and the men were exhausted. On November 19th, Jock Lewis and his stick staggered into the rendezvous and collapsed. The LRDG men did what British soldiers do in such circumstances. They put on tea. Bully beef was opened. Cigarettes were handed round. Lewis, the ascetic, the man who had made the training at Cambridge a byword for severity, was drinking sweet tea with men from a unit he had never met and trying to work out how many of his comrades were still alive. On November 20th, at dawn, Mayne came in with the remainder of his section and Bonington's survivors. The story he brought was the same. No airfields attacked, equipment lost, McGonigal missing. Mayne was particularly devastated by McGonigal's disappearance. He would, years later, when Gazala was finally in British hands, return there and search for his friend's grave, never finding it. A few hours after Mayne, an LRDG patrol brought in Sterling and Tate, the last men to reach the rendezvous. The LRDG searched an 8-mile front over the following day in the hope of picking up stragglers. They found none. Of approximately 64 men who had boarded the 5 Bristol Bombays at Bagouche, 21 had reached the rendezvous alive. 34 were missing, wounded, captured, or dead. Not a single Axis aircraft had been damaged. The demolition charges, the entire reason for the mission, had never been placed on a single target. The operation had achieved, in strictly military terms, precisely nothing. Sterling rode back across the desert to Cairo in a long-range desert group truck. He had 48 hours to think about what he was going to say to Middle East headquarters. He knew, everyone in the unit knew, that the normal consequence of a catastrophe like this was disbandment. The men would be returned to their parent regiments. The experimental unit would be closed down. His idea would be filed under failed experiments and forgotten. What happened next is the hinge on which the entire history of the Special Air Service turns. Because Sterling did not accept the verdict. The key, it turned out, was the long-range desert group itself. During the long drive back from the Trig Al Abd, over several hundred miles of desert that almost no British soldier had ever seen, Sterling had the chance to talk to the LRDG men for hours. He watched them navigate. He watched them drive trucks across apparently featureless sand and gravel and arrive at the exact point they had aimed for. He listened to them describe their patrols, their routes, their hides, their knowledge of the inner Libyan desert, and he realized something that the planners back at Middle East headquarters had never grasped. The parachute was not the only way to deliver a raiding party to an airfield. The desert itself could deliver them. Quietly, without noise, without warning, dropping them not from the sky, but out of the empty sand to the south. By the time Sterling reached Cairo, he had a new plan. He proposed that L Detachment be given one more chance. No parachutes this time. The LRDG would drive the raiding parties to within striking distance of the Axis airfields. The SAS would complete the final approach on foot in the dark, place their bombs, withdraw, and be picked up by the same trucks. It was, in effect, the plan that the SAS would use to destroy more than 250 enemy aircraft over the following 18 months. It was the plan that would win the regiment its regimental status in September 1942. Auchinleck said yes. More accurately, Auchinleck said yes because the commander of the LRDG, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Prendergast, had already sent a signal from Siwa Oasis on November 28th, suggesting that since the LRDG was not trained for demolitions, the SAS parachutists should be used for the job instead. The pieces locked into place. The survivors of Operation Squatter were augmented by the handful of men who had been held back. Bill Fraser with his mended arm, Jock Byrne recovering from his earlier injury, and others who had not been fit enough in November. The unit withdrew in late November to a forward Oasis base called Jalo, recently captured from the Italians, about 140 miles south-southeast of the coast. Jalo was a ragged caricature of a desert refuge, an old fort, some palm trees, pools of brackish water, tens of thousands of flies, and a wind that never stopped. The SAS and the LRDG shared the base. The LRDG taught the SAS desert navigation. The SAS taught the LRDG demolitions. The partnership that emerged over the following 6 weeks would be, for the rest of the North African campaign, the engine of British special operations. On December 8, 1941, 22 days after the catastrophe at Gazala, David Stirling and Paddy Mayne left JLO with an LRDG patrol commanded by Captain Gus Holloman. Navigating for them was a young Englishman who had emigrated to southern Rhodesia in 1937 and who would become one of the most famous desert navigators of the war. Mike Sadler. Their target was a pair of airfields on the Libyan coast at Sirte and Tamat. On December 11th, they were spotted from the air by an Italian Caproni reconnaissance aircraft, exchanged fire with it, and avoided being bombed. Stirling assessed that the Italians would now reinforce Sirte. He split the force. Mayne would take his section and attack Tamat. Stirling and Sergeant Jimmy Bruck would continue towards Sirte. On the night of December 14th, Paddy Mayne walked up to the officers' mess at Tamat Airfield, kicked the door down, and opened fire with a Thompson submachine gun. Minutes later, he and his 5 men were moving along the lines of parked aircraft, placing Lewis bombs on 24 Axis fighters and bombers. The fuses were timed for 30 minutes. The raiding party was out of the base and moving back towards the LRDG rendezvous when the first charges began to detonate. Stirling and Bro at Sirte found the airfield deserted. The enemy had moved most of the aircraft during the alarm, but they were able to shoot up enemy positions along the coast road before extraction. Mike Sadler at the LRDG rendezvous in Wadi Tamat heard the first explosions 3 miles away and saw the fire in the sky. Within days, another raiding party under Lieutenant Bill Fraser, the officer whose broken arm had kept him out of squatter, walked onto the airfield at Agadabia and destroyed 37 aircraft in a single night. On Christmas Eve, Mayne returned to Tamat, where the Germans and Italians had, as he had predicted, replaced the squadron he had wiped out 10 days earlier. He destroyed 27 more. Between the night of December 8, 1941, and the end of the month, the combined SAS-LRDG operations destroyed well over 100 Axis aircraft and many vehicles at the cost of a handful of British lives, one of whom, heartbreakingly, was Jock Lewis himself. Returning from a raid at Nophelia on December 30th, Lewis's vehicle was strafed by a German fighter. He was hit in the thigh and bled out in minutes. The man who had built the training system, invented the bomb, and saved the unit's fighting method did not live to see the unit he had forged reach its first anniversary. But the unit lived. And this is the central, almost unbearable irony of Operation Squatter. The disaster of November 16th and 17th, 1941, the worst opening to any campaign by any British Special Operations unit before or since, was the thing that made the regiment what it became. If the weather had been clear that night, if the drops had gone in on target, if even partial attacks had been made on the airfields, the SAS would probably have continued as a parachute unit. It would have continued to suffer the losses that parachute operations into defended enemy territory at night invariably produced. It would, in all likelihood, have been absorbed eventually into the existing British Parachute Regiment, remembered as a minor wartime curiosity. Instead, the storm destroyed the parachute model in a single night, and in doing so, forced Stirling to find a different way. The different way, ground mobile insertion, partnership with expert desert drivers and navigators, intimate intelligence of terrain, small teams operating for extended periods with no support, became the founding doctrine of modern special operations. 64 years later, when British SAS patrols in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan were carrying maps and compasses instead of satellite uplinks, the operational grammar they were using had been written, in its essentials, on a desert track called the Trigalabd in November 1941 by 21 exhausted men who had walked out of a storm alive and by a young Scots Guards officer who had refused to accept that it was over. Of the 64 men who took off from Bagush on the evening of November 16, 1941, 34 did not come back. Many never had a grave. Ian McGonigal, whom Patty Mayne searched for until the end of the war, lies somewhere near Tamimi. Ken Warburton and Joe Duffy, killed in the parachute accident weeks before the mission, lie in Egypt. Sergeant Cheney lies somewhere in the desert no one has ever identified. Jock Lewis lies in the sand near Nophelia. His grave has never been located. They are the men on whom the regiment was built. The flaming sword of Excalibur, designed by Sergeant Bob Tate, a man who had jumped into the storm and walked out, became the regiment's cap badge. The motto, chosen by Sterling, was "Who Dares Wins." On the night of November 16, 1941, the unit that chose that motto had dared and had not won. Within 6 weeks it had come back, and by the time the North African campaign ended, the Germans had given David Sterling a nickname of their own, the Phantom Major, and the Special Air Service, the brigade that had never existed, was on its way to becoming the regiment that would define what the word Special Forces would mean for the rest of the century. The SAS almost didn't exist. It very nearly died on the stones of Libya on a single stormy night. But the men who walked out of that storm built something no one could ever disband again.